Chapter 7. Who's in charge? I have an irrational fear of relationships that I attribute to shame of my circumstances and what others might think of my poverty. The very few friends who have visited, they've never mentioned it. Not even Jenny, with her OCD preoccupation with tidiness. Fear is an essential part of who we are, and it's deeply etched in our genetic makeup and explains why we're so bloody violent. The survivors among us can take a moment to rationalize the cause of fear, to see if it has real value or is an overreaction to new and challenging circumstances. It's the familiarity with stressful situations that teaches us to be destroyed by constant anticipation or develop strategies for dealing with them. In my case, so it seemed to me anyway, I'd grown accustomed to bizarre and troubling situations. I'd chosen to employ the mentality of acceptance and tolerance until I was compelled to act. There again, some of the situations that others would have found terrifying during the time Shadow was about, I somehow found tolerable. Of course, I had nothing to lose. While others might run screaming in terror, I merely stood my ground and watched and listened. I discovered that even when attacked by ghosts or weird stuff, I was viscerally incapable of stepping back, which surprised me. Yet, asked me to commit to a relationship and I'm the biggest ninny in town. I didn't know why I was unable to abandon myself to normal human messiness. I'll get to the fridge freezer in a moment. I needed to make sense of what had been going on in general. I'm not sure how it goes. So far I'd come up with 3 explanations. 1. Shadow attracts ghosts and weird shit. 2. It's me. I attract ghosts and bizarre shit. And 3. Neither was correct, and the island attracts ghosts and bizarre stuff. You know that I'm a wimp and a wuss, so of the 3 explanations, you'd probably opt for the first. It's the damned cat. It had to be him. He was the one who attracted all the troubles. I also thought that he was a callous little bastard for whom all of it was either an entertainment or a hobby. My feelings were clearly secondary. Not even that. My feelings were not even a consideration. I had 2 defined roles: feed the cat and be a weathervane for incoming storms. Anyway, that's what I thought. It was a sound theory and I had yet to experience anything disproving it. It was a few weeks after my rather pleasant experience with Mr. Warburton, when Shadow turned up. And immediately adopted normal cat mode. Although it was a damaged cat mode this time. He either slept or he ate, and then not much. It was all disjointed and very uncomfortable to watch. He did nothing else. Except I suspected he was on the phone to his bookie every time I went out. Something profound had happened to Shadow this time and I was frightened by the depth of his exhaustion. I even considered taking him to the vet. But I had decided not. The fact that I couldn't afford to pay a vet was a component of that decision. So I had to leave him to his recovery on the sofa and I just got on with my life and gardening. Shadow showed sarcasm, anger and irritation easily. So I eventually stopped irritating him with my constant coming in and out to see how he was doing. Although some evenings he would indicate some form of affection, as close as he got, by turning to face me. I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I wondered what was going on between those small pointed ears of his. Maybe I was getting through in my attempts to seek an equality. Perhaps he was just content in his exhaustion to listen to plays on the BBC Sounds app along with me, and liked the sci-fi and mysteries. I guessed he was being political in his affection because he'd probably need my assistance again. I used to sit at one end of the sofa and he on the other, snoring gently with the odd bit of unconscious hunting. Because I knew what those claws could do, I kept a close watch in case he got carried away in his dreaming and depressurization from fighting his galactic foes. I'd never seen him that exhausted. And it made me think that wherever he'd just been, it had been rough there. Maybe there had been a serious battle ending in total capitulation by an alien enemy. Either that, or he'd been staying on someone else's sofa. Too many maybes surrounded Shadow. I knew nothing about him. All I had was suspicions based on our little adventures. Too much speculation. I now agreed with Jenny that somewhere nearby a portal opened, and he trotted through. But of course, she knew nothing about what ensued, and I suspected that somewhere out there he'd have left his colleagues, deposited his weapons in a box, hit a switch, and then walked back into our world. That's how I chose to describe what might have been going on with the narcissistic and cold-hearted little warrior. Jenny insisted that he was my little mate. Oof. How the universe must hate me. And that my little mate had been sent to keep me company because, as she said with passion, you were bloody useless at getting off your ass and meeting nice people. My one-time response of, "What have people ever done for me?" received short shrift, a pout, and somehow I still received a hug before she left. I'm so lucky to have someone as genuine and trustworthy as her in my life. The hugs, however, they were damaging because they made me realize just how much I miss them in my life. Jenny is cruelly considerate and at the same time deviously Machiavellian. Shut up, I told myself. You're luckier than most people, because your only responsibilities are to yourself, a cat, and fighting the odd monster. So I had nothing to complain about, did I? Other than the fridge freezer. The weather had improved considerably and the garden showed encouraging signs of glorious delights to come. It was a surprising week of temperatures in the low 30s. And my old fridge freezer responded to this by panicking and burning out its motor, or whatever it's called. I'm a bugger for buying and freezing any meat and fish sold at a discount in the local supermarkets. It's an expediency born of fear of abject poverty and the consequences of Brexit. I knew I had about a day and a half before the packed contents of the freezer began to melt. Time was against me. I'd gone through this before and ended up with food completely defrosted by the failure of the freezer. I bought a new reconditioned freezer, the one that had just packed up, and refroze the melted food. I mentioned the fridge freezer situation to an old work colleague, Sasha, who I met in the supermarket. Her mother had sadly passed away about the same time as mine, and it had really knocked her for six. I must have been drowning too much in my own troubles to attend to her loss. It's never easy for carers. It had taken her a few years to move on despite the support of the man now her husband. That's Sasha's recent past. Anyway, she and her husband were refurbishing her mother's house at last, before renting it out as a holiday let. I'd be doing them a big favor, she insisted, by taking her mother's old fridge freezer off their hands. I was delighted and could feel my leaking financial boat sail slightly further back from the abyss. I had a quick inspection of the fridge freezer in the immaculate little holiday home they were creating. Sasha was delighted that it was going, and a cute nef coming in its place. Although it had a few rust marks and scratches on it, it was in good working condition. After a half-hour's joint effort, Sasha and I managed to force and fit it into the back of my small blue Ford Focus. And in a near-comedic manner I drove away with my forehead against the windscreen. They somehow survived the rickety ride down the track, the freezer and my head, that is. Everything had gone so smoothly that it felt like we were meant to be together. Shadow offered indifferent support from the sofa when I walked it in through the door. I replaced all the now melting food in the new freezer and switched it on, not exactly what you're supposed to do. I welcome you to my frequently desperate little world. It clucked, buzzed and hummed immediately. Nice and clean, it was fulfilling its purpose. Each freezer shelf was packed. The top is the fast freeze where I keep my meat. The next two down offer quick access, cheap tuna steaks, salmon fillets, fish cakes, fish fingers, petit pois, stewing steak, a few pork medallions and famous clone ice creams. The small fridge atop was barren, other than milk, yogurt, cheese, a bag of salad and other odd bits and jars. Shadow was peering at me over the sofa armrest. I stood back, pleased with myself. From problem to solution in little more than a day, I told him. But unfortunately, he didn't appear particularly interested or impressed. I poured myself a half glass of Rioja and sat down on the sofa to consider what I would do with the old freezer leaking outside. Shadow glanced at the wine and gave me a dirty look. Pay some rent and I might listen, I threw back at him. He held my gaze for a few seconds, shrugged and replaced his nose under a paw. Such an articulate little bastard, I thought. I don't know why Shadow kept going on about it. I very rarely overdrank. And I mean that. I didn't. I sipped the wine and thought about diet in general. Not bad if you consider the multivitamins, cod liver oil and fizzy vitamin C tablets. But there were too many days when I didn't feel like eating and forced myself to eat porridge and supplement that with 2 or 3 yogurts. Then other times, I dreamed all day of a dinner with gravy, and made sure I achieved it. Supper reared its ugly head over the parapet once again. There's only one big problem with dinners. And that's eating them alone. Before where I am now, I only cooked a meat and gravy dinner for my mum before she went into the hospital. Those memories add a sad bitterness to my gravy. But on the other hand, if you can't cuddle a person you like, then an excellent meat and gravy dinner can be a decent close second. I went outside to delay any food decisions and studied the leaking fridge freezer. I could easily stick it in the car and take it to the recycling center. Yet I felt that would be a waste. Recycle? Upcycle? I do it here. It would be useful as somewhere to germinate or nurture plants if I could take off the door and place a long polycarbonate sheet across the front. That's what I'd do. I'd have to tidy it up and maybe paint it, because there's nothing worse than a crappy old fridge freezer in your garden. You might as well stick a rusting Ford Cortina on a pile of bricks next to it and declare yourself a willful slob. The fridge freezer was humming gently in its place near the Belfast sink and would occasionally buzz and even mumble. That was new. A mumbling freezer motor? In an infinite universe and all that. At least it hadn't cost me a penny and was beginning to refreeze the stuff I'd put in it. Even though it might only be a temporary solution, I had to be happy. If this thing got on my wick, there was always the charity outlet in Holyhead that sold refurbished white goods. Still, I was more content than if I'd had to spend money I barely had. Shadow insisted I was punctual in all my duties to him and that he remained my priority. Once he'd been fed and watered, I shuffle-walked the old refrigerator into the middle of the garden between the raised beds. I left it where I was, hoping to build a little table and gazebo from pallets I'd been promised. I stood it facing south. I unscrewed the hinges and took off the door. I'd have to make shelving rather than use the plastic receptacles for little plant pots and trays. Wooden slats would have to do. I placed the door up on the back seat of my car and left it there for its final journey to the dump. The freestanding refrigerator looked all right in the garden but would soon be a rust bucket if I didn't paint it. It'd have to be a tidy nice color too, or Jenny would be on my case. I made my usual evening tour around the garden, to ensure that everyone was all right before settling down. I always talked to all the plants. Told them they were brilliant and offered encouragement. I suppose it made up for a lack of knowledge and chemicals. I shut the front door and reached for the half glass for which I'd earlier received a dirty look from Shadow. I'd drunk almost precisely one half of the half glass and maybe some of that could be attributed to evaporation. Shame on you, I told the cat. You carry on doing that and I'll get drunk just to spite you. A fish cake meme had been running around in my head since I'd transferred the food to the new freezer. Rice, frozen peas and fish cakes. And I'd drag it through the garden, depending on the condition of the tomatoes and or greenery in the fridge. Gravy tomorrow then. Sounds like my life, that does. Not today but tomorrow. Always tomorrow. The fish cakes were only partially solid, so that shortened packet to plate to person time, which always made me happy. They went under the grill on a medium heat. The peas were frozen and the rice was tare and nuke type. I boiled the kettle, poured it into the saucepan on top of the frozen peas and left them to defrost and cook on a gentle heat. The salad leaves near their putrefaction date needed attention to tear off everything brown and slimy. Next, I split 2 salad tomatoes and stuck them alongside the fish cakes under the grill. Cooking is all a matter of timing, whether you nuke or you ponce about and have a bit of a Doris around the kitchen. The torn bag of rice was upright in the microwave, ready to be nuked. That was also a freebie from a friend and is about 25 years old. The microwave and not the rice. It's probably as safe as Chernobyl on a bad day. And it had crossed my mind to make myself a tin foil jockstrap whenever I approached it. The evening meal was on its way and I drank half of the half glass of wine and held it up for Shadow to inspect. See, I abused his sarcasm. Restraint under extreme pressure. You should try it with your farting. It no longer had anything to do with addiction other than addiction to conviviality. Nothing wrong with that. Hello. The hum that had earlier been a buzz, preempting future concern, had changed into a murmur, an intriguing murmur too. Like a low vocalized series of mumbled complaints. It's a fact that humans feel more secure if they can bring a logical pattern or understanding to what doesn't make sense. We're not always correct in the cause we attribute to a noise. Of course it wasn't a complaining Nan, which is what it sounded like, just a straining motor. It sounded like a murmur. I scanned Shadow on his sofa in his sleep coma and saw nothing that should give me cause for concern. So I dismissed it as new fridge noise, focused on turning over the fish cakes and I nuked the rice for 2.5 minutes. I laid the salad leaves on a broad plate and then removed half of them for more than just aesthetic reasons. All the while, the fridge murmured pleasantly. It stopped when I opened the door to fetch a small pot of tartar sauce and a yogurt to warm up for pudding, and it didn't start up after that. Old noisy fridges nearly always stop making a noise if you slap them somewhere. Opening the door seemed to have cured it of humming, buzzing and murmuring. I'd remember that. I stood at the sink and perused my plate of food. For me, it seemed unreasonably healthy as long as you didn't go into close-up of the salad leaves. It was the kind of meal I'd need if I were to achieve that six-pack I was dreaming of having. There was a thin layer of fat I needed to get rid of, but it was attainable. I wouldn't say I like tummy crunches because of the pain, but like in my old climbing days, There was a stinging, tingly physical pain you became addicted to, because you know it is muscle being created. The meal was eaten, plate and cutlery washed and kept. The advantage of nuke and packet meals is that there's hardly anything to wash and clear up compared to after a bit of a Doris. I settled down next to my buddy, who seemed to want to apologize for calling me a dissolute and a failure earlier. I barely believed it, but he propped himself against my left thigh and began plucking away. I thought it would end when I leaned forward to pour myself another half glass of wine, but it didn't. I lounged and read an Anne Cleeves novel with light music on the radio and was subjected to more occasional plucking. Then, when I was putting on my gym jam bottoms, I saw a series of serious scratches above my knee. Was the little bastard sniggering? I went back into the living room and pointed this out to the aforementioned cat while dabbing TCP on the scratches. I didn't want any alien insects bursting out of boils and invading the world. Well, actually, invading the world was fine by me, but bursting out of me? I wouldn't be happy with that. Shadow looked up, checked out the TCP'd scratches and went back to sleep, paw over nose. It was cute if you didn't look beyond. In the past, I used to chuck out the cats on quiet nights that time of year. I've never really bothered with Shadow because he had his methods of moving in and out of the house when I wasn't around. What they were, I didn't really know. He was either on his sofa first thing in the morning or coming down the track looking like he'd been out killing something interesting. Like many things about the cat, it was best not to ask and much easier to make up silly explanations. Once again, Shadow took to sleeping at the bottom of my bed, which I found as surprising as the plucking. However, I knew it couldn't be attributed to affection, or even an acknowledgement of my role as his carer. He was probably just too tired and sharpening his claws on me was the closest thing to hand. I'd always liked having cats sleep on my bed, so I accepted it. However, I'd recently woken up at night with him leaning on my leg in the darkness of the hour of the wolf. It made me ponder physics. For instance, why is a sleeping cat heavier than one awake? While lying there in the darkness, your hearing becomes more and more acute. And as I said, you give noises a shape that doesn't really belong to them. In other words, I could hear the refrigerator humming and occasionally mumbling. If it was complaining, then I was on its side because no matter how often I shifted, Shadow always woke me up leaning heavily against my legs. The next few days were productive in the garden. It was satisfyingly tiring, and so many vegetables were beginning to become more than little seedlings. They all looked incredibly healthy and robust. But it was still early, and around here I knew I was prone to frost in the dead air of a sheltered spot. There were a few cold nights and thick dew in the mornings. Thankfully, there was no severe coldness to threaten my precious babies. The tulips seemed to thrive on the cold, and they grew strong and blousy. I honestly don't know what type I have, but they're yellow and ochre sunburst. Or as I say, lousy and glorious. And I was worried about the odd rose I had about the place. It felt too early for them, and I wondered whether I'd put them in too rich soil that might be forcing growth too soon. I don't know. I was making it all up as I was going along. I'd started gardening and planting too late to offer nourishment for the early insects like the bumblebees. The wallflower seeds I'd collected last year from Edward's garden were coming along slowly in the fridge. Because they're biennials, I knew I was beginning to achieve my ambition to make this garden a favorite place for butterflies, moths, and any friendly insects in the vicinity. In my own small way, I wanted to leave my portion of earth a bit better for my being here. What I'd missed out on in spring, I was determined to make up for in late summer with perennials like Rudbeckia, Guidea, asters, and heleniums. Those I'd been obliged to buy. Thankfully, not having to spend money from the house contingency fund for the fridge had made that possible. In the meantime, all life went about its business while the fridge freezer hummed, buzzed, and murmured. Especially at night. I don't know why. Maybe it was in response to the fire I built on the still cool evenings? Shadow didn't give me any more plucking after that, and no three-legged little aliens burst out of my skin. However, he insisted on sleeping on my bed. I didn't enjoy a full night's sleep for about 5 days. Shadow was both long and heavy, and at full stretch there wasn't much room for me. I hated sleeping diagonally because my unconscious seemed to know that this wasn't a favored position, and it kept waking me up to let me know. For those 5 nights, my enemy within kept waking me because of the heavy enemy without. I asked him why he continued to insist on sleeping on my bed and not going out to torment someone or something else, but all I got was a look that told me nothing other than remind me who was boss. I countered by telling him it was me who was filling his belly with food, and paying for it, and I came away with the impression that it was only right. I eventually concluded that the noise of the fridge freezer was disturbing him, so he chose to make my life difficult because I deserved it. I eventually began to burn out, and entered into that daft phase again of not wanting to eat anything. It didn't take much to put me off my food at any time. If you add to that the fact that I was still performing my exercise regime every morning, including the excruciating tummy crunches, then I wasn't being a good friend to myself. I was even too tired to enjoy a glass of wine. And that's saying something. All I would do was open the freezer and stare into it, especially when it was murmuring. I'd ask it what I should choose. I was back on all-day yogurts and cereal. I tried to kick myself out of that stupid condition. Not easy that, because as Jenny kept reminding me, I'd clearly fallen through the stupid tree when it came to looking after myself. If I'm not going to look after you, she lectured me, then who the hell is? Leave me out of any equations. I've brought up 2 children, endured noisy grandchildren, and will not add you to my list of unwanted responsibilities. If I weren't in this permanent state of mind, then I don't think I'd have achieved as much as I had in the garden, which had been my ambition for the past 20 years. So it turns out that melancholia has its upsides after all. That's a wibbly-wobbly karma theory sustained. That nothing happens without a reason. Whatever it was that had caused Shadow's exhaustion, I didn't know, but the exhaustion had passed and he was back in full stuffing of his face recovery mode. Every time I came in, got up from the sofa or prepared food for myself, he was there, looking up at me expectantly. Finally, I told him that this was only one half of the contract between us and that something had to come my way. Alien creatures infesting my leg didn't count. I know you're trying to control me, I told him. And I immediately gave away my power, by saying but I have free will. How he must have laughed. I repeated that meaningless mantra whenever he forced me to give him a handful of kitty cocaine. And all the while, the fridge freezer murmured as an acceptable new familiar background companion to daily life. It would occasionally make a clanking sound like machinery breaking down. We both looked at each other, and kept looking in anticipation until it rattled back on. I liked the fridge freezer because it was beginning to irritate Shadow, which was an excellent bonus for something I got for free. Most days, I was content to hang around the garden planting and weeding. The old freezer was working well as a propagator, and had been painted a pleasant minty green from a mix of old paint around the place. Long before I moved in, a coal-fired range had been removed from the fireplace and dumped outside. It now stood redundant at the bottom end of the cottage. I was never a fan of barbecues, because I think eating burnt offerings, as Dad called them, can't be good for you. But as I say, this was a fully functioning old-fashioned range, a rich color combination of cream and rust, about 4 feet across with 2 old-fashioned circular temperature dials. There was a fireplace for burning cokes to power the device, 2 small ovens, one either side of the open fire, and 2 hot plates, one rectangular and the other circular. It was built from heavy cast iron, and, other than a bit of rust, it looked decent enough and actually worked. Even though I hadn't cooked anything on it yet, I'd got a fire going that heated both ovens and the hot plates. I knew I'd only be cooking out here what I cooked inside. But that was the magical thing, I would be cooking everything outside. My days passed well enough, and each small task completed was a significant achievement. It might have looked like a life wasted from the outside, but for me it was a life enhanced by simplicity and remained stable if not moving forward. Plus no monsters. Now and then, I still wandered off to the beach for a long walk to rid myself of cobwebs. I hated being fuzzy-headed. I hadn't been to Church Bay for a while for reasons I might have stated elsewhere, although I knew I should go and see my old friend Thomas, who'd saved my life. I'd say that notwithstanding these little victories, it was now difficult to overcome an inertia that had crept up on me and was beginning to slow me down. It was exhaustion caused by a cat who continued to sleep on my bed. Someone asked me once, "How do you run up a mountain?" I used to be able to do that. I always gave the same answer. It doesn't matter how slowly you go, just don't stop. I might only have been rocking backwards and forwards on the balls of my feet in terms of life, but I was still moving and had no intention of stopping until I had a beautiful garden. It's amazing how plants can give you a legitimate reason to carry on breathing. I ambled to the refrigerator daily and listened to the murmuring for inspiration. It sounded more and more like a conversation between 2 gossiping old ladies in a shop. Or maybe one dotty old lady talking to herself. I'd occasionally offer the odd bit of flippant shopping advice. I thought no more of it than a way to amuse myself, and I admit it did sound as if a burbling response came back at me. I believed I'd gathered all those discrete voice components from the fridge freezer into a woman's soprano voice. Just now and then I heard her. After feeding Shadow one fine evening, I sat down to check if there were any emails for me. Something from the house-sitting agency maybe? There was a problem with my mobile phone at the time, so I was reduced to using my laptop. That laptop was ridiculously slow, but my mobile was even slower. I don't do apps, I only do Hammer. And it came close with the mobile phone, and I only kept it in case Jenny or Nell Davis phoned me. Other than using it to teach myself tarot, the phone was, comparatively speaking, redundant. I should have unsubscribed from so many things, but I was always too scared to do so, in case it was a false link that opened up a great big digital abyss. Still, I found that I remained attractive to pneumatic Russian ladies who couldn't spell, had lovely eyes, and were inviting me for an evening tracing their tattoos. I was also on the verge of becoming a Bitcoin millionaire, and as usual, my order was ready. I set the laptop diagnostics running, and intended to follow that up with a security check. All this was more an expression of alpha maleness that continued using technical terms without really knowing what they meant. To further assert my superiority over the flat crystal bucket, I told it to switch off after it had done all that. Satisfied with my alpha maleness, I got up and went toward the sink, undecided whether it would be a cup of tea or a glass of wine. I chose neither, because on the rug in front of the fridge freezer were my pack of frozen salmon fillets, jacket potatoes and petit pois. Thrown into the sink was a yogurt and a carton of semi-skimmed UHT milk stabbed onto the draining board. Seeking something positive in that unexpected scene, I was glad that someone, or thing, had found the long-lost carving knife. I took a moment to check my sanity. I distinctly remembered cleaning and tidying up and then moving about 6 or 7 feet away from the sink and fridge freezer to sit on the sofa to muck about with the laptop. I took a moment to check the clock inside my head, concluding that I'd sat there for about 20 minutes and hadn't got up at all during that time. I leaned over the back of the sofa. Shadow. Weird shit time again, Shadow. I pointed at the floor. He chose to indulge me and propped himself on the armrest to look over at the floor and the sink. He gave me one of those looks that said, "Why'd you make this mess?" To which I shrugged a denial of responsibility. Shadow stayed there for a moment and had a good look about the place. He was sending out his weird shit radar. Then he looked at me again before returning to access standby mode in his little corner. If Shadow wasn't worried, then neither should I be. It must have been Eva Hughes again, despite his alleged fear of cats, according to Edward from Top of the Track. I saved what remained of the milk in a jug and took a spoon to the yogurt. I kept the rest and decided they would make a nice tea the next day. It was weirdness with a silver lining. The same thing happened the next day. And Shadow actually got up off his fat ass and came to inspect matters when he heard me trying to reason with the fridge freezer. He gave me a look that said he was intrigued, and maybe it wasn't just me losing my marbles. It was a meal suggestion for the next day. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, I say. I ate the salmon grilled with partly nuked jacket potatoes finished off in the oven after being bathed in olive oil and seasoning. Shadow spent the entire evening in his little spot staring into nothingness and thinking deeply. His ears revolved at the sound of any change in the noise from the fridge freezer. "Have we got a ghost in the fridge, Shadow?" I was only joking, but he didn't reply or even indicate that he'd heard me. Must be big trouble out there somewhere. Let it stay out there. It'd be a while before I discovered what was going on in his head. More importantly, what was going on in our little world? A lot of frightening stuff was going on. So much that I didn't know about and should have worked out earlier. At about 10 o'clock, Shadow hopped down onto the replacement rug from the Red Cross shop with a pleasant little thud. He marched to the door and sat and stared at it as usual. It was all part of his telekinetic powers for opening a closed door. He expected me to open it on command. Anything for an easy life. I opened the door and out he popped, disappearing immediately into the blackness. While he was out, I went back to the fridge freezer. On the third shelf was the defrosting plastic tray of the diced beef I'd bought the previous week. It was supposed to have been in the back of one of the freezer shelves below. I looked at the proffered plastic tray of meat and decided to make a stew in the slow cooker. That would keep me going for a couple of days. I thanked the fridge ghost. As if. I wasn't overly worried, but it did cross my mind that I was losing more and more of my autonomy in my own house. The cat commanded me as he wanted, and the fridge freezer had taken over my diet. It wasn't the way I wanted to live out my days. Eva, you bastard. If this is your doing, then bloody stop it. Do you hear me? Either that or I'll find where you're buried and get the cat to piss on your grave. I bet Mrs. Hughes wouldn't be happy with that, would she? He didn't answer. Before I went to bed, I found my packet of gravy granules in the Pyrex measuring jug on the draining board. Sitting next to it were 2 onions and a small jar of mixed herbs. I give up. I surrendered in exasperation. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was beginning to slide. My mother had died of dementia, and it was something that continued to horrify me. I'd made plans to preempt that outcome and had laid the means in a secret place that I hoped I'd remember when the time came. I'd once hoped it would be years yet, but as I found with my mum, life can be so appallingly cruel. The shadows had stolen her away far too soon. I finished the dregs of the bottle of wine and made my preparations to go to bed, knowing that I'd triggered for myself a horrible night of too much thinking. Thinking too much is bad and should be banned. I took longer than usual and kept opening the door to see if Shadow was back, because I wanted him sleeping on my bed to keep me company. In the end, I gave up, and went to bed alone, hoping he'd be back soon. Thankfully, a closed door was no barrier for Shadow. I left some kitty cocaine in his bowl and poured some fresh water. By the way, kitty cocaine is that addictive cat treat he loved. I kept the world service on and fell asleep for a while. My unconscious woke me up a few hours later. Shadow was back and stretched out at the bottom of the bed where my legs should have been. I felt relieved. And the funk seemed to have passed. With any other cat I would have reached down to pet them. Not with Shadow, if I wanted to keep my hand. This warrior didn't seem to do affection. He only did eating and sleeping. Before I fell asleep again, I asked him a favor. If I start going off, you'll take care of me, won't you? You know what I mean. Warrior style. All of a sudden I was terrified that he'd leave me. He stirred in the darkness as if reflecting on my request and then settled down to sleep. For a while I listened to the fridge chatting with itself in the other room and cursed Eva Hughes. Then after a while, my agonies eased off and I drifted into the shelter of a deep dreamless sleep. The food I'd returned to the fridge the previous evening was back on the draining board when I got up. So I switched on the kettle and went to find the slow cooker. Shadow was nowhere to be seen. Locked door or no locked door, I knew he was outside somewhere honing some vicious skill or other. I smiled as I imagined him in a clearing in the little woodland performing his morning feline ninja kata's. For all I knew, he was doing precisely that, leaping and bounding hither and thither, striking down invisible foes. I'd seen him fight, and witnessed the deadly elegance of a skilled killing machine. There was certainly more to him than being a member of his species. Unless they were all like him. Dear Lord! What chaos would that bring if they all acted the same? After my morning exercise rituals, I browned the chunks of meat in my small frying pan, making the usual fatty mess all over the cooker. I was chopping the onions to sauté in the sticky bits when there was scratching at the door. I rolled my eyes and went to grant access to the superior species. Shadow trundled in, indifferent to anything important I might have been doing. You don't need me to open the door for you, so why'd you keep doing it? He stopped halfway in and glanced up at me, pondered a moment, then gave me that look that only lacked a sarcastic roll of his eyes. Then he went to his bowls and sat on his haunches, impatient for waiter service. Fish or meat, I asked, and went to the box under the sink. I closed my eyes and rustled about before pulling out a sachet. Salmon. You like salmon, don't you? I've got plenty of whitefish, by the way. Because you won't bloody eat it. I picked up his clean spare bowl from the drainer and squeezed out the smelly mix of fish paste and any fermented socks to hand in the factory. Then, ever obedient to his requirements, I placed it in front of him and picked up the licked clean bowl that had held his supper and kitty cocaine. What am I going to do with all these whitefish sachets? Forget it. The warrior was dining. I could put them all in an envelope and send them to Greece. I wonder if they like cats there. I gently browned the onions, put the meat back in the pot, added some chopped up carrots, stunned garlic cloves, a big spoonful of dried mixed green herbs, plenty of black pepper, a stock cube and a half, and all the boiling water in the kettle. I switched it on to slow and would keep an eye on it. It should be ready by supper time. I sipped my coffee in the doorway, as was my habit before getting on with things. All the raised beds I'd created were full of the greenery of young plants. I could also see that I'd planted too many potatoes, and earthing them would be difficult. I remembered. There was an old petrol strimmer that I used on the grassy middle of the track, so why didn't I use the clippings to earth the spuds? I'd seen someone do that. And it would make life easier, although it would look grey and crappy by the time the spuds were ready in a couple of months. Nasturtiums. What do you think? I turned and suggested to Shadow, who was halfway across the floor to his sofa. I'll plant some nasturtium seeds around the spuds. A bit of color. What do you think? At least he didn't argue against the idea. I frowned. How do you fancy doing the hoovering to pay for your keep before your kip? He hopped on his sofa and circled his wagons a few times before settling down. After a bowl of cereal and a small pot of strawberry yogurt, I picked up 3 empty supermarket bags and wandered off to collect some kindling sticks in the woods, and look for Shadow's ninja practice ground. No secret ninja training places, but I did find a heavy tree branch that I could saw and chop up. Might do. I listened to a blackbird singing his Chinese love song and heard some rustling in the nearby undergrowth. I should bring the strimmer in here to clear up a bit. But this was nature balancing itself out as usual, thick brambles and all. I'd brought home a lot of guilt from Mr. Warburton's after destroying an established ecosystem, and it insisted I look at the branch again. Those things are full of all manner of insects, bugs, bacteria, and mycelium, each an astonishing miracle in itself. So I left the branch where I found it and felt reassured by the wonder of nature recycling itself. I felt calm and reassured once again, as I picked up the 3 bags of kindling and took them back to add to the pile in the outside field loo. That was another project to be undertaken. Live the life you choose every day that was left to you. There wasn't much to be done in the garden, and the weeds were yet to get going. Just a matter of time though. Elbow grease is always cheaper and better than a pesticide. After all, for an idiot species we're only passing through, and should leave nothing more than footprints and nice flowers. So best leave things tidy nice after us if we can. I pottered about for the remainder of the day, repairing a few things overdue attention. I also had time to make a small chimney for the old outside oven. I found a piece of cast iron drainpipe that fitted snugly into place. A plate of meat and 2 veg with gravy can sometimes be a minefield of bitter-sweet memories. I boiled some spuds, mashed them, and poured the slow-cooked beef stew and its jus over them. I made great mash. Equal amounts of potato and butter with a bit of skimmed milk thrown in just in case the butter fascists turned up. I was only allowed to eat it once Shadow had given my plate a good sniff. This really can't be good for digestion, I told him, as I leaned over the small table by the sofa to eat with a fork and spoon. Then once most of the bulk had been consumed, I leaned back and ate the remainder with a spoon. I thanked the fridge when I rinsed and washed the plate and cutlery and then sat down to write in my diary for whomsoever might one day be interested. 3 diaries I'd filled, and not a single mention of anything salacious. It was too early to contemplate the spare bottle of red by the unwanted whitefish sachets beneath the sink. Instead, I leaned back and stretched my neck over the back of the sofa and wondered how I'd kept up the illusion of liquidity. Until then, my lifestyle was a miracle of ducks that always seemed to line up in an auspicious manner for me. I'd been so financially incompetent that I'd been simultaneously paying 2 occupational pensions for the same job. I never saw it on my payslips. Payslips could have been printed in hieroglyphics for all the attention I gave them. I then discovered I had yet another pension after leaving the bastard. A strange pension letter I received puzzled me. When I phoned them up, I found that I had a third. There was a little money left on Mom's house after paying off her ridiculous care home bills, and with the 3 small pensions I'd been managing. I'd invested the little money left after Mum in premium bonds. That last pension and lump sum allowed me to escape from a land of lying bastards and pay for this lovely barely habitable little cottage before Jenny paid for reparations. How I kept surviving was a miracle. Jenny must have been in charge of guardian angels. It had to be her, because sure as hell couldn't have been me. I now received a £350 early pension a month, which was subsidized by the last one of the other 3 pensions that I'd cashed in. I reckon that had I been so inclined to stretch things further, I would have had enough money to last me another year, but I wouldn't be able to afford the toasting session. I looked across at the chair between me and the fireplace where Eva Hughes had sat that appalling evening. It had originally belonged to my aunt. She wouldn't have been happy having an unwashed old farmer sit in it. She'd have made a few colourful comments about his underpants. I was about to make a sarcastic point to Shadow about paying some rent when I heard someone moving outside the door. I wonder who that is. I didn't receive casual visitors, and so I turned to Shadow. No Shadow. He'd obviously walked through the wall when I wasn't looking and couldn't be bothered to do the same on the way back in. Maybe there was a daily limit to the volume of stone a cat can walk through? Where the hell have you been? I was talking to myself there. I swear the little bastard smirked as he circled his wagons again. He sat there staring at me. I was never sure if he was amused, bemused, disappointed, or just puzzled by me. As long as I kept him fed on his R&R visits, he'd keep coming back and I'd feel safe and not alone. Notwithstanding his obvious mercenary tendencies, I did enjoy his company and the safe pattern his needs brought to my day. And I admit that his absences always left a bit of a muscle memory regret. Anyway, where have you been? He turned away and stared at the door deep in thought. I'm convinced the little bugger understood every word. Where do you go when you disappear? You know we've made up this theory for you, don't you? Jenny and I reckon that you disappear off somewhere to fight aliens on the other side of the galaxy, and only come here for a break. Would you confirm that for me, please? Shadow kept staring thoughtfully at the door as if in a dilemma. What was he pondering on, I wondered? Protecting me or dumping me? Waiting for yourself to come back, are you? He turned, and he gave me such an intelligent look, that I was both shocked and frightened. I froze instantly, but managed to carry on breathing. I rationalized what I'd seen, and distracted myself with thoughts of the fridge freezer. And I was past it. What do you think the advice is going to be for tomorrow's tea, Shadow? Oof. That was scary. Where the hell did that come from? Blink, damn you. I leaned back and checked the sink and draining board over my shoulder. Nothing there yet. At least next time you go off, I'll have the fridge for company. It might even give me a shopping list and pay for it. If our financial luck doesn't change soon, we might both of us be eating the whitefish sachets, mate. I didn't touch the wine. And nothing in my underdeveloped psyche was cheesed off by that decision. So I went to bed early again and fell asleep diagonally with Shadow taking up too much space yet again. I listened to the companionable sound of world business news on the BBC World Service and vaguely remembered, wondering if the presenter had left his South Wales shed after COVID. It was only an hour later that I was awoken by one hell of a racket. We were being invaded by aliens coming in through the roof and blinding me with lasers. Either that or I was having a stroke. I must have jumped out of bed because the next thing I knew, I was standing over it, dizzy from sleep and shock. I checked that all my limbs were functioning correctly and recited the Welsh alphabet backwards to prove my limited marbles were still in the tin. There was no sign of Shadow. That meant business. Something moved under the duvet, and I pulled it back with a panicky little shriek. It was Shadow, where he'd been since I switched the light off. What the hell's going on? I shouted at him over the noise of the house being demolished. He raised his nose over his paw and searched around a moment before disappearing back to sleep. Apparently, there was nothing to be worried about. Eva, you bastard. If there's a cow in there, I will go out right now and piss on your grave. I looked back into the bedroom and shouted at Shadow's lump under the duvet, I take it I can depend on your moral support, can I? You never knew. He might have been moved to action by the sarcasm. Please don't ask me why, but since I left the bastard job, I'd left my sandals at the bottom of the bed at a slight angle towards the door. They weren't there. Maybe they'd walked off? Maybe saying the Welsh alphabet backwards wasn't a good enough test of cognitive function after all. Maybe every odd thing that had been going on for the past few months was just a Bobby Ewing it never happened event. I was angry enough to be stupid, so when I strode into the corridor I brought plenty of violent intent along with me for company. All the living room lights were flashing like some dissolute's disco, and it appeared that someone had thrown my sandals at the front door. Either that or someone had stepped out of them haphazardly. It crossed my mind that my idea of being fine was no more than a delusion. I stood by the sofa on the verge of panic and peeing myself. When I looked back toward my bedroom, Shadow was there on the floor, slouched casual as you like and just looking at me. He was probably wondering what I was going to do next. Not on my watch, I shouted. I wasn't going to go bonkers on my watch. It wasn't working, and I needed a brown paper bag. And I needed it quickly. What? A new panic set in. I lived alone, and before formulating my plans about the Parker Knoll and the woods, I'd always been afraid of falling dead here in the cottage and not being discovered for ages. If I was suffering a stroke, I didn't want the last response to having lived to be a young police officer puking at the sight of my maggot-ridden body. Shadow would have probably eaten half my face by then anyway. In life I've had minimal impact on the world and its inhabitants. In death I could psychologically cripple someone forever. I didn't regard that as an upside. The lights went off. I stepped forward and heard something fly through the air with a whoosh. I screamed when it landed on my feet, freezing and malleable. I danced and jumped about as another alien attacked my face with something more solid that exploded and covered me with slime. Object after object struck me repeatedly, as barrages of alien weaponry had me targeted. The light came back on, and I stared wide-eyed about me and screamed again as my foot came down on A bag of frozen peas? I almost broke my neck sliding on my burst yogurt cartons. I grabbed the sofa arm and ducked as a frozen half leg of lamb caught me with a glancing blow on the side of my head. I stared in disbelief as packet after bag after sachet flew out of the freezer and across the room. Everything fell eerily silent, except for the carton of UHT milk which was gurgling and pouring onto the floor off the draining board. Skewered with the same knife as last time. Obviously not a fan of UHT. I licked my lips. Strawberry. It could have been worse. There was a carton of double cream past its sell-by date in the fridge. I was saving it to have a go at making simple butter. Please let that be in there still. I found the dishcloth, rubbed the yogurt off my face, and found myself in that unsettling hinterland as a prelude to throwing up. Movement at the corner of my vision caught my attention and distracted me from puking. Shadow was leaning against the doorframe and casting his bored gaze around the room. Lastly, he fixed on me as if saying, "Nothing to do with me, pal." A echoing frail elderly voice call from the fridge freezer. "Not now, Jane." Followed by a silence that was swallowed up by my tinnitus. I immediately checked Shadow for confirmation that he'd also heard it. He'd heard it. He presented me with that distinctive puzzled feline furrowed brow of his, and sent his senses around the room. He stood silent and still for a moment's consideration, gave me a non-committal look and then left for his bed. I took a deep breath and nearly jumped out of my skin when the freezer clicked on. The buzzing and murmuring began simultaneously. I stayed silent and wary for a few moments before I realized that the performance was over. I cleaned up the mess best I could, glad it was yogurt this time. I repacked the fridge freezer. Thankfully the cream was still in there. The rest of the mess was consigned to the sink until morning. Half an hour later, after a wash and change of t-shirt and gym jam bottoms, I was back in bed, still buzzing with adrenaline. I remained like that, beyond sleep for a few hours before I finally got up, retrieved my sandals and made myself a coffee. I sat out in the garden to be reassured by the dawn chorus that the rest of the world was still behaving. Eventually Shadow came out and sat next to me on the potato bed retaining wall. Neither of us spoke. I snorted a laugh when I looked at the front door. It was closed, and yet the cat was sitting next to me. I reached out, and he allowed me to put my hand on his back. "In the end, you'll have to tell me how you do that, my little friend." To bump myself out of this still over-adrenalized state, and the coffee really wasn't helping, I went off up the track for my morning exercise ritual, of walking, listening to my French lesson, and performing simple stretches. I left out the dumbbells and tummy crunches this once. In case I threw up. Once I'd finished, I made another coffee and stood wondering what to do about this latest crisis with which the universe had gifted me. It was 8 o'clock by then, so I found my mobile. It was working, and I gave Sasha a call. She picked up the call almost immediately. Unlike me, Sasha's a motivated go-getter morning person. Sash is just over 6 feet tall, Nordic beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed and athletically slim, and she beamed with a fierce intelligence if ever challenged. "Hi," she muttered. "You're early. Everything okay?" I heard her spitting toothpaste into the sink. "What's up? Fridge blown up?" How to form it into words. "Who's Jane?" I asked. "Jane? What? I don't know. Hang on. We had a cat named Jane. She died years ago. Why are you asking? More to the point, how do you know?" "You never told me how your mother died, Sash. Sorry to ask strange questions this early in the morning." "Strange call indeed. Ma'am died of COPD because of her vascular dementia just like your mum. Why do you ask?" Curious as that might seem, I'd never asked. We'd lost contact a few years ago when Sash moved on, and I in my state then had done little more than send a condolence card. "I think your mum's haunting the fridge," I said abruptly, bereft of diplomacy. "She's what?" I told her what had been happening the last few days, and she laughed out loud. I even told her I thought that I'd been losing the plot. "Poor you," she said. "And poor ma'am. I'll be over after work." I wished her well for her day and went and filled Shadow's bowl and refreshed his water. Then, somewhat relieved, I went back to bed until midday and tried to find a way back into my routine. Sash called by as promised. She looked $1 million in an expensive elegant dark trouser suit with a wine-colored silk blouse. She'd cut her long blonde hair since I'd seen her a few days earlier and was wearing an unfeasibly attractive pixie cut. We hugged as always, and sat down to a small tea I'd prepared, while she told me about her poor mother. I loved it when Sash pulled Shadow onto her lap to be cuddled, and he gave me the evil eye. Sash told me about her mum Sarah before they'd found her a care home. She'd become increasingly preoccupied with feeding her children, even though they were grown up and had left, apart from Sasha. We realized afterwards that we were fighting the same battle simultaneously but in different places. It was difficult for Sash. And the food wastage was immense. All of it came from Sash's pocket. In the end, Sarah began to hallucinate seeing Jane, the long-dead cat, and Sash finally realized that it wasn't safe for her mother to stay alone at home during the day. After her ma'am had gone into the care home, Sash told me that she'd met her future husband Danny, a successful online businessman, and he'd footed all the bills for Sarah's care, which is why the house was still hers after her mother died. After tea, Sash asked to be left alone to chat with her mom and handed Shadow across to me. I suggested she just put him on the floor. So we both went out into the garden and waited. When Sash joined us, she looked emotional and mildly anxious. She picked up an unhappy-looking cat for comfort and we both stood there a moment before she spoke. "It's Mum all right? I was hoping you were joking." The freezer sounded exactly like her when she used to mumble complaints about us kids. "So what are we going to do? I'd hate for her to be stuck in a fridge for eternity." I needed the refrigerator working. And we both wanted her mother at peace. "Do you think we should get hold of an exorcist or something?" I asked. "The local vicar might have a special service or something for haunted white goods." I didn't know what to do, and had hoped she might come up with a few ideas. For a fridge? Mum would be mortified, as it were. "We'll have to think of something else." "Okay," I said and hoped I sounded enthusiastic. Heaven only knew what we would do. And I figured Heaven had a bit of a responsibility here. We parted with a hug, both of us still baffled about what we might do. Before Sasha left, she went into the cottage and told her mother she'd be back soon. That night, Sarah was busy again. I chose to sleep through the demonic disco and discovered one hell of a mess in the morning. This time she'd emptied all the kitchen cupboards and carried on with her hatred of UHT milk. I decided that the remaining milk would be best kept in the field loo for a while, guarded by the solitary giant spider. Even Shadow was cheesed off at having his sleep constantly disturbed. Finally, on the third night of banging and clanging, he'd obviously had enough, and hopped off the bed, landing with the lovely soft thud of that interaction between cats and rugs. I switched on the bedside light and listened. The banging stopped a few minutes later. Then there were 10 more minutes of silence. The bedside lamp flashed a few times before Shadow jumped back onto the bottom of the bed in a position guaranteed to spoil my rest. "I hope you weren't unkind to her, Shadow." He raised his head, and I could have sworn that he looked offended by the very notion of cruelty toward the poor woman's ghost. "Sorry," I said. I cleared up the mess in the morning and accepted that the buzzing was the mechanics of the freezer doing its job and nothing more. I believed that Shadow had somehow delivered Sash's mum to her eternal rest and reported it to Sash at lunchtime. I left out the feline intervention. She was relieved and weepy and thanked me for my kindness, which I rightly passed on to Shadow. The fridge freezer continued to hum. And I finally persuaded myself that it was only trying to be companionable.